Right now, your heart is sitting on a golden scale. On the opposite side sits a single ostrich feather. If your heart weighs even a fraction more than that feather, a creature crouched in the shadows is waiting to erase your very existence from the universe forever. This is not a campfire story or a modern horror flick. It is a set of instructions buried in the scorched earth of Egypt for over 3,000 years. A survival manual for a journey through a landscape so terrifying that the living were once forbidden from even speaking its name. For the ancient inhabitants of the Nile, the moment the pulse stopped was not the end, but the beginning of a high-stakes gauntlet through a realm of shadows known as the Duat. This was a world where the laws of physics dissolved, replaced by a predatory geography of fire, silence, and psychological trials that would challenge the sanity of any traveler. Most people today view the Egyptian Book of the Dead as a dusty collection of myths, but to those who lived under the shadow of the pyramids, it was a literal map to the abyss. They called it the chapters of coming forth by day, a series of codes and passwords designed to navigate a dimension where every shadow had teeth. To die without these spells was considered a fate far worse than death itself. It was the prospect of the second death, a total annihilation of the soul that left no trace in the cosmos. The Duat was not a place of rest. It was a shifting, labyrinthine underworld, populated by entities with names like He Who Dances in Blood, or the One Who Feeds on the Dead. These were not just deities, they were the guardians of the gates, and they did not accept apologies or excuses. They only accepted the correct words, spoken with the precision of a master thief picking a cosmic lock. Before a soul could even set foot in this terrifying landscape, the physical body had to be transformed into a vessel capable of surviving the transition. This is the origin of the preservation rituals that still haunt our modern imagination. It was never about vanity or a simple desire to keep a corpse intact. It was a sophisticated, dark technology intended to anchor the spirit to the physical world while it navigated the hazards of the beyond. The opening of the mouth ceremony was perhaps the most crucial and unsettling of these rites. Using a ritual tool often forged from meteoric iron, metal that had fallen from the stars, priests would touch the face of the deceased, symbolically restoring the ability to speak, eat, and breathe. This was essential because in the Duat, your voice was your only weapon. If you could not speak the names of the guardians you encountered, you became their prey. The geography of the Duat is described in ancient papyri as a subterranean mirror of the Nile, but one filled with lakes of fire and mounds of gloom. Every night, the sun was believed to descend into this realm in a golden bark, fighting a desperate war to emerge on the eastern horizon at dawn. The deceased were expected to join this celestial convoy, hitching a ride through 12 distinct regions, each representing an hour of the night. Each hour was guarded by massive gates and monstrous sentinels. These beings were often depicted with the heads of serpents, vultures, or hippos, wielding blades and watching for any soul that lacked the proper credentials. To pass, the traveler had to address each guardian by their secret name, a task that required absolute memory and nerves of steel. A single stutter or a forgotten syllable could result in being cast out into the eternal darkness of the void. Among the many terrors of the Duat, one loomed larger than all others, the great Serpent of Chaos. This entity was not a god to be worshipped, but a force of pure destruction to be feared. It was the embodiment of non-existence, a massive presence that coiled around the foundations of the world, waiting to swallow the light and plunge the universe back into the primordial silence of the deep. The spells found in the Book of the Dead are filled with desperate pleas and aggressive incantations to ward off this entity The Egyptians believed that the struggle between order and chaos was a literal battle happening every single night beneath their feet. They saw themselves as active participants in this cosmic war, where the survival of reality itself depended on the success of the traveler and the sun in defeating the serpent. As the soul progressed deeper into the night, the trials became less about physical monsters and more about the weight of one's own life. The traveler would eventually reach the Hall of Two Truths, a place of chilling silence and overwhelming judgment. Here, 42 divine judges sat in a semicircle, each representing a specific transgression. The deceased had to perform what is known as the negative confession, standing before these silent entities and declaring their integrity. I have not stolen. I have not caused pain. I have not stopped the flow of water. It was a trial by integrity. In this realm, lies were thought to carry a physical weight, and the atmosphere of the hall was said to be so heavy with truth that a single falsehood could crush the spirit. At the center of this hall stood the scales of Ma'at, the goddess of cosmic balance. This was the moment of the ultimate audit. The heart of the deceased, believed to be the repository of all their deeds and memories, was placed on one side of the scale. On the other side sat a single feather, the symbol of truth and order. This was not a trial of good versus evil in the modern sense, but a trial of harmony. Had you lived a life that was in tune with the rhythm of the universe, or had you been a source of friction and chaos? If the heart was heavy with the leaden weight of a life lived selfishly, the scales would tip. Waiting beside the scales was the devourer, a nightmare creature with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. She did not hunt the living. She waited for those who failed the final test. If the scales tipped, the heart was tossed to her, and she consumed it instantly. This was the second death. There was no hellfire, no eternal torment, and no chance for redemption. There was simply nothing. The soul would cease to exist, its name erased from the records of time, and its essence dissolved into the cold, unthinking chaos of the abyss. This prospect of total non-being was the true terror of the Egyptian mind, a horror so profound that they spent their entire lives and vast fortunes preparing to avoid it. If, however, the heart was as light as the feather, the traveler was declared true of voice. They were then ushered into the presence of the Lord of the Dead, who sat upon a throne of lapis lazuli. But even this was not a place of idle rest. The Egyptian afterlife, known as the Field of Reeds, was a perfected version of the world they knew, where crops grew taller and water was sweeter, but there was still work to be done. This is why tombs were filled with small blue figurines designed to come to life and perform the labor of the deceased in the next world. Even in paradise, the Egyptians believed in the necessity of action and the maintenance of order. The sheer complexity of these rituals and the terrifying detail of the Duat raise questions that modern archaeology is still struggling to answer. Why was an entire civilization so hyper-focused on the mechanics of the afterlife? Some researchers suggest that the Book of the Dead was not just a religious text, but a psychological map for navigating altered states of consciousness. They argue that the monsters and gates were metaphors for the internal barriers of the human mind, and the weighing of the heart was a sophisticated form of moral self-reflection. Others look at the precision of the preservation process and the alignment of the tombs with the stars, and wonder if the Egyptians possessed a forgotten understanding of the soul's connection to the cosmos. There are strange overlaps between these ancient descriptions and modern accounts of near-death experiences. People who have returned from the brink often speak of tunnels, bright lights, and a life review that mirrors the Hall of Two Truths. They describe encountering beings of light or shadow and feeling a profound sense of judgment that is not based on external laws, but on their own internal truth. Is it possible that the ancient Egyptians weren't just making up stories to explain the unknown? Could they have been documenting a recurring human experience with the only language they had, the language of gods and monsters? The spells themselves are often bizarre and highly specific. There are spells to ensure the deceased doesn't have to walk upside down, spells to make sure they can still drink water, and spells to prevent their identity from being stolen by a soul snatcher. These details suggest a world that was perceived as highly mechanical and dangerous, a place where the rules were fixed and unforgiving. It paints a picture of a universe that is not necessarily hostile, but one that is profoundly indifferent to those who are unprepared. In the Duat, knowledge was the only currency that mattered. The dark allure of the Egyptian underworld continues to ripple through our culture because it touches on the most fundamental human fear, the fear of being forgotten, of being judged and found wanting, and of simply disappearing. The Book of the Dead serves as a chilling reminder that for the ancients, the struggle for survival didn't end with the last breath. It was a brief transition where everything you had ever done and every word you had ever spoken would be weighed against the weight of a single feather. Today, we look at the golden masks and the silent figures in museum displays, often forgetting the sheer terror they were meant to ward off. We see them as artifacts, but to the people who created them, they were survival gear. Every amulet wrapped in linen, every line of hieroglyphs painted on a coffin was a desperate prayer for protection against the devourer. They lived their lives in constant preparation for a journey through the dark, convinced that the shadows were crowded with entities that knew their names and their secrets. As we move further into an age of science and data, the mystery of the Duat remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of human history. Was it all an elaborate vision born of a death-obsessed culture? Or did the Egyptians stumble upon a hidden dimension of the human experience that we have since lost the keys to? We may never know for certain what lies beyond the final gate, or if a presence truly waits in the silence for those who fail the test of the scales. But as you sit in the quiet of the present moment, it is worth wondering if you were standing in that hall of silence right now, facing the 42 judges with your life laid bare, would your heart be light enough to pass? Or would the shadows finally begin to move? The legacy of the Duat is a testament to the human spirit's refusal to accept the end as a finality. It is a story of defiance against the void, a complex and terrifying vision of a world where justice is absolute and the soul must fight for its right to exist. Whether the Book of the Dead is a roadmap to a literal underworld or a mirror of our own internal struggles, it remains one of the most provocative documents ever produced. It reminds us that while we may fear the dark, it is the light we carry within us, our truth, our integrity, and our memories, that ultimately determines whether we fade away or emerge into the dawn. In the end, perhaps the most unsettling thing about the Egyptian underworld isn't the sentinels or the trials, but the idea that we are the ones who ultimately decide our own fate, one heartbeat at a time. Imagine the silence of a tomb, the air thick with the scent of resin and ancient dust. For the Egyptians, this was not a place of stillness, but a launch pad. Every carving on the wall was a living instruction. They believed the soul had multiple parts, the Ka, the Ba, the Ak, each requiring specific care and nourishment. The Ba, often depicted as a bird with a human head, was the part that could fly between the worlds of the living and the dead. But to keep the Ba strong, the physical body had to remain intact, acting as a beacon in the darkness. If the body was destroyed, the Ba would lose its way, wandering the Duat, until it was eventually consumed by the many hazards of that realm. This creates a chilling realization. The pyramids, the hidden valley tombs, and the elaborate sarcophagi were not just monuments to power, they were life support systems. The ancient Egyptians were perhaps the first civilization to view death not as a state of being, but as a territory to be conquered. They were the original explorers of the invisible, mapping out the architecture of the afterlife with the same precision that modern scientists map the stars. And yet, for all their preparation, the final moment always came down to that single scale and that single feather. No amount of gold, no number of servants, and no level of worldly power could tip the scales in your favor. Only the truth of who you were at your core mattered. As the sun sets today and the shadows stretch across the ground, remember the Duat. Remember the guardians at the gates and the serpent in the abyss. Whether you view these as ancient myths or as metaphors for the trials we face in our own lives, the message remains the same. We are all travelers through a landscape we do not fully understand. We are all carrying a heart that will one day be weighed. The question isn't just what happens when the pulse stops, but what we are doing right now to ensure that when we finally face the scales, we are ready to speak our names into the dark. If the ancient Egyptians were right, the most important journey of your life hasn't even begun yet. And the shadows are always watching, waiting to see if you have the words to pass.